Today, my topic is relating to students, and it's something I really care about. And I want you to know why I feel this way, and I think it'll come out in the course of the presentation. In teaching, your knowing the material that you're teaching is important. But getting the students to know it and getting the students to care about it, that's a very different game. And it's in that kind of attempt to move this from a passive experience on the part of the students, or as old folks call them, kids, to getting them to feel that this is not just something in which they are the listeners, the note takers, the test takers. Mortimer Adler, in an old book, How to Read a Book, it was called, defined a lecture as a device where the notes of the teacher become the notes of the pupil without passing through the minds of either. And that's a very, very common human experience in which I know this happens constantly because I have been on both ends. There are people who are just writing it down, making sure that they've got it ready for regurgitation, throw back the same pap on a test, and really don't care about it, don't think about it, and so on. So the question then is, how can you change the whole teaching experience so that in relating to the students, you can make the students real partners in the enterprise? So the first part of our outline says teaching the students and not the material. That is, to really relate to the students. First, you should look at them, and that's very important. I can tell you how easy it is to give a wonderful, terrible lecture. Our department was once recruiting an assistant professor, and we had a whole bunch of people come out and give talks to the department. And one of those talks was so magnificent, you felt as if we had had a stenotypist there, we could have just sent it off to a journal and it would have been published. It was so clever, so well thought out, so well organized. And we on the faculty said, well, no matter what happens, we have just bought ourselves a fabulous teacher. Within 1 year, we were getting complaints about this person's horrible teaching. And the reason was that he prepared every lecture that way. Every lecture was a magnificent summary of knowledge and an image of what ought to be done, and he delivered it while sometimes looking at the ceiling, sometimes out the window, sometimes at his watch, but never at the students. He had no idea what they understood, what they didn't understand. There were never opportunities for them to come through to tell what they didn't understand. There was no communication anyway about the importance of different parts of it. So when he was lecturing to his colleagues at his own level, they understood. They had the background. It was easy for us to follow him. When he lectured to just ordinary classes of bright, somewhat motivated students, he lost them. So that to look at your students and to get feedback, to see that he is smiling and she looks worried, that this kind of reaction helps you to know whether things are going well, whether students are puzzled, whether they're looking at their notes to try to figure out where are you. All sorts of hints come back to you by not looking away, but feeling that this is your audience and it matters to you greatly how they are receiving the words that you throw out. And so you must react to their level of understanding and interest. If you say something which is startling and nobody notices, then you, for example, will point out that this was supposed to be a big surprise. How come nobody reacted? And you will soon find out that they didn't understand the sentence before either. So in various ways then, reacting to your students is part of the teaching process. And reaction to your students only can come by your paying attention to them and to the way that they are reflecting what is occurring. Now, I said that our emphasis is on relating to the students and not on the material. But let's spend a few seconds on the material that you cover in a lecture. One of the first things to do is to have before you an image of what the students already know. And often you're wrong in this image. So that it is very important to say, do all of you know what this concept is, even though you know they took the course, even though you know they're supposed to know? And when you ask this question, you have to wait. If you ask a question of a class and then say, any questions? They go on, there will be no questions. What you have to do is wait until a few brave souls have an opportunity to raise their hands. And if in a class of 150, 3 people raise their hands, you know that at least 75 don't understand this material. It's brave. It takes bravery to say, yes, I do not know. So that you want to find out what they know, and if even a few indicate that they are lost, then take action, because there's a large proportion of the class needs help on this particular thing. Another aspect of covering the material is how much material in a particular lecture. Now, my tendency is always to teach too much, always to have too many things, because I care about the material. I say to myself, these poor kids will never be exposed to it again. This is my last chance to tell them about this particular subtopic, and therefore I try and get in what I think are the important things. I find a tendency on my part to try to teach too much rather than teach a few things well. And I first saw this in the process of my courtship of the woman who became my first and last wife. I was in love with her, and because of that, followed her to summer school where she was registering, and by accident the person didn't show up to teach a class, and so they said to me, only 3 months out of undergraduate school, why don't you come back and teach this course this summer? So that was very pleasant to be a teacher in my undergraduate alma mater, and of course a lot of my friends signed up for the course. I had problems grading because I had to grade people by their phone numbers and social security numbers, because I knew I couldn't grade them honestly if I knew that this was John or Jake or Jane. So I was in this class and teaching a course I had never taken, so I worked so hard learning the literature. I spent hour after hour in the library. I read everything. I had these hundreds of little 3x5 cards. One day I stayed out very late with my beloved. And whereas typically I was really well prepared and had all this material to produce, the next day I walked in and I only told them what I remembered. At the end of the class, 2 of my friends came up and they said, "Sandy, were you prepared today?" And I felt terrible. They had found me out. And I said, "No, you caught me. I really wasn't prepared." And their response was, "We could tell. It was so much better." And I realized that I was not really asking what did they want to know or what should they know, but instead was just throwing out all the material that I knew in an attempt to, in a sense, cover the topic, and nobody could say I left anything out. But it is in fact a tendency on my part to do too much, or try to do too much, which has to be, for me at least, to be resisted. The next thing I want to mention is that you have to respect your students' schedules, and that has several different aspects to it. The students, if you're going to care about them and what happens to them, they have other things to do. They have other courses. So, for example, to give your midterm at a time that's particularly bad for a large number of the students, when there's no particular reason to have it on that particular date, that's just being obnoxious and uncaring. That you should really try to find out how does it fit in to the overall schedule of the students. You should worry about such things as their jobs or the team trips that they have to go on, and make it possible for them to live up to their varied obligations and not have you saying, "My course comes first." To a large extent, these things are outside of their control. They should be considered outside of your control, and therefore what you do is you adjust, you make arrangements, and the students appreciate it, they don't cheat, and in fact, both you and they are better off. And the next thing about covering material is to discuss your own work with enthusiasm. Many students take courses because they want to take 4 credits or 5 credits or 3 credits. Or, put it this way, this is the only Tuesday, Thursday, 11:15 to 12:05 course they could find. Many of them have no real interest in the material. You, we hope, have a real interest in the material. Therefore, in general, you should try to cover some of the things that you work closely on. Why? Because when you're talking about your own field, you have an opportunity to tell them why it matters, to tell them the problems, intellectual and other kinds of problems, in getting the work done, and thereby give them a little bit of the flavor of what it's like to do research, to care about something that at first to them would be something of unimportance, and to you is filling your life. If you can communicate some of that same enthusiasm, they can feel not only for that aspect of the course, but perhaps extend it to other things. Now that doesn't mean, when I say speak of it with enthusiasm, to explain why you're doing the greatest work ever done in this arena. What I mean is the enthusiasm about the importance of it, the difficulties of it, the concerns that you have. And that personal touch will, I think, communicate well to most of the students. Now, I'm going to talk in just a minute about the different ways of presenting material to different kinds of students, but I'll pause right now for any comments so far, or any questions. Yes?
I'll ask one. I attended a lecture last week by someone in computer science who is concerned that the top students in the class be given material that's challenging, especially this is a class that gets students of all different kinds of backgrounds. So essentially, he set up a system that doesn't penalize students who don't do extra work, but does reward students who do. And he has very interesting assignments for them if they want to take it on. And apparently, students who do often put enormous numbers of hours into these extra assignments. And I wonder to what extent you do want to encourage students to be so single-minded. You're implying that you should respect they have other obligations and other schedules. How would you look at that question?
Michelle asks how to handle the issue of extra assignments, extra work to do, extra possibilities for the students who are most interested and most talented. And how does this conflict with my idea of respecting the general schedule of the student? First of all, I see no conflict at all, because what you're doing, and what I was referring to, was to make sure that the things that you require people to do are, as much as possible, harmonious with the schedules that they have to, of the lives that they have to lead. Whether, if people want to stay up all night and work on your course, don't stop them. But let it be their decision rather than your stock in the no-dose company which produces it. The question as to whether you should have a system of rewards for those who do more work is much more complicated. Many people believe you should not reward, but that you should encourage, and you should make it clear how you do it. By encouragement, you produce more intrinsic motivation over the long haul. On the other hand, since students are busy, it's perhaps the case that having some immediate classroom payoff may get more people to start to do additional things. But you must do it at in a way that does not penalize the other students for not working harder, which, by the way, brings up something that isn't on this outline, which is about grading on a curve. Which, grading on a curve, not something that I brought in here, is to me anathema, is exactly the opposite of relating to your students. And you see before you the person who was responsible for changing the grade sheets at Stanford University. When I first came here, they had on the back of the grade sheet percentages. What percentage should get an A, what percentage should get a B, and so on for large classes. And I taught a class of 400 students and paid no attention to the curve. I gave grades in terms of what I thought the students had learned, and in no way corresponded to the curve. And the registrar, who was then in charge of enforcing these regulations, called me and said, "You must grade on a curve." I said, "I won't." Now, I had tenure. This was a real problem for them. So they changed the form. That is, they just didn't know how to handle somebody who said no. And it seems to me that grading on a curve is a device where, instead of encouraging collaboration among students to work together, to learn together, to teach each other, what you're doing is saying anything that she learns, he suffers for. And I really believe it's antithetical to true learning. Other comments or questions from younger students than Michelle? Nobody cares about anything? Yes?
How much do you encourage students to relate to each other in a way that sort of, can you foster sort of empathy that would facilitate learning and questioning and, sort of openness that sometimes isn't there.
The question is, how can you foster cooperation, openness, assistance to each other, and so on? Well, let me start by telling you, I think that's very hard, and most of the time I fail. So, you know, we get all these nice lies told by Michelle, but I want you to know that this is one of the toughest things to do, because we come out of such an individualistic, competitive situation in which the students got here by being good in and of themselves. And they don't like, in some ways, participating with others, being dragged down by others who aren't quite as hardworking or good as themselves, each thinking that he or she is the leader. I think that that's a very difficult task. I have many times given assignments to do short pieces of work together, collaboratively, and made them only a small part of the grade, because if it's a large part of the grade, the students are really so resistant at Stanford that it doesn't work. At the same time, that's the real world. In the real world, you don't operate as an individual. And your ability to work together with others is going to be far more a determinant of what happens to you than is your ability to work on your own. So I think, A, you're absolutely right that this is worth encouraging. B, it's very hard to do. C, don't make this such a large part of your agenda that you fall flat on your face and thereby ruin the entire course. But nevertheless, attempts along this line I think are very desirable. Did I answer you? How about you?
You were saying that it's often hard to get brave souls to ask questions in a large class.
Right.
And I think that happens a lot in the sciences where classes are several hundred people and no one asks questions when the professor stops asking, if there are any questions. But then afterwards, 50 people come up and ask the same question.
Yes.
How do you get students to ask their questions?
That's an excellent question, which I'll take up in just a minute. It's right on my outline. Encouraging discussion and questions, so we'll come to that, and I think I have an answer, because I get discussions and questions in classes of 400 and 500. But you have to have a technique for doing it, and I'll tell you what it is. It's very simple. Other comments or questions? Yep.
Question related to that. It seems difficult, at least for me, to find out what the students know or what they don't know.
Right.
And yesterday I had a section, it was my second time ever, and I said, do you have any questions from the lecture or any reading? And there was no question. So I decided to do an exercise from the book. And then all sorts of questions came up, and I wasn't quick enough to take them and sort them out and to figure out how to give answers to all of them. And we would run out of time, of course. So it's, I mean, to get what they know or what they don't know and what I can offer is difficult.
All right, why don't I, since two people have brought this up, why don't we just skip this from that two kinds of students paragraph that I was going to cover and go to the encouraging discussion and questions. And I think this is something that I can do and I can be successful. See, you asked me, well, how do you handle the group work? And my answer is poorly. But this is something that can be done. I find, for example, in human biology, there are almost no questions in the lecture sections. Almost no other teacher does it. And you come in, and there is a tradition now. The tradition is you sit there and you listen for 50 minutes. And the first time I say, any questions or discussion, blank. So I just stand there. Now, after a while, it's so uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me. You know, I may be waiting 20 seconds, but it seems like 2 hours. And all of you, I'm sure, as TAs or teachers have had this experience, that when there is a dead silence, everybody looks away, and it's very awkward. And you feel as if a lot of time is passing. Probably it's a very short time. And soon, the lack of comfort, the discomfort, becomes so great that somebody's willing to ask a question just to end it. Then when they ask a question, you say, thank you, and you restate their question. Doesn't matter how bad it is. You make it into a really good question, and you answer it and thank them for bringing up this point which you have messed up or didn't sufficiently communicate or whatever. Once you do this, if you do it every 5 or 10 minutes in your lectures, so it isn't, see, it's not that you wait at the end of an hour when people were lost at the end of the first 10 minutes. Instead of waiting a long time and then they don't know quite what to ask without revealing that they didn't understand the last half of the lecture. If you do it repetitively, the people really get the spirit, and the questions do come fast and furious. But you have to be willing to stand that lack of comfort at the beginning, and to be willing to just wait and say, I'm going to hear from some of you. Okay? Not everybody has Michelle as a, what do they call a pitch man? A shill to ask the first question. But even that's not impossible, to say to people who come up to you after class and ask a question which is very good. And you say, now, we're going to review this a little at the beginning of the next hour. I want you to ask this question again in front of the whole class, because it's so important that they all hear about it. And that is an honest, sincere thing you're saying, but it breaks the ice. Okay? So I think that the time for the students to respond is the key missing ingredient. If they believe you sincerely want to hear from them, they will come through in large classes. And to have hundreds of students is the guarantee that there are some people who would like to ask something or discuss something. Then you must respect their responses. You must never indicate in any way that that is the stupidest question you have heard this year. I can tell you of an experience that occurred in the human bio curriculum. A very fine teacher, teaching most of a quarter in the core, had one student who asked a question that indicated that this student didn't have the slightest idea what was going on, had missed the whole point of lecture after lecture, and might as well be taking these courses in Kankakee or Timbuktu. And the lecturer, who is a very nice person and who's usually very respectful to students, denounced that question. That is, said, that question shows you don't understand, and so on. Do you know that in human biology, every evaluation by a student is read by 4 different faculty for various reasons? And I have never seen such unanimity about this particular teacher, about how this teacher didn't care about the students, that this teacher didn't respect the students, that if this teacher felt this way, why were they teaching the course? On and on and on. And it only was about 30 seconds of ill-mannered response. But it was enough to poison the entire course, or at least the relation of the teacher to the entire course. So no matter what they ask, you say, let's suppose it is a very fundamental point. Then you say, this is a fundamental point, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's so important that we all really agree on this and understand this so we can move on. If it shows a misunderstanding, apologize for the misunderstanding. I haven't done a good job of communicating that because I didn't mean this, I meant that. And on and on, you communicate your respect for their responses. If you're going to pause for them to respond, you better have them feel that every response is going to be greeted positively. And what do you do when you got grad students, like yourselves? When you have grad students, you play the game even more dramatically in terms of action by the grad students. Instead of giving the answers a la lecture, ask the questions. How should we handle this problem? What way might we look at this? What should we consider? The grad students hate when you do this because it puts them on their mettle. They feel they should know, and often they don't. And again, you have to terrifically reward every grad student who comes up with a good idea and not be shocked when they can't think of something. But nevertheless, by making them play this very active investigatory role, then in graduate seminars, you are, again, keeping yourself from being the person on high who throws out the dicta which are to be recorded. The persons on high reminds me of a very small little example. When I teach in a large lecture hall like Cubberley, I was just last week giving some lectures in Cubberley, I never stand up on that platform. The worst thing of all is to be on the platform and, to exaggerate it, stand behind the lectern. You stand behind that lectern and there's a body that's between you and them. You're looking down at them and you are paying a price. The price is real social distance. So I always stand down at the same level as the students, making myself more approachable. They don't even know why I'm doing it. Maybe they think I don't like for them to see me. But whatever the reason, it really does make a difference that you should not try to stand up as I'm doing now. I do that because of bad back and I apologize for it. Or in some ways, be raised on that dais. Go back to the previous paragraph, and I want to talk about two kinds of students. Now, as you know, we can split the world an infinite number of ways. Here's one way to split the world. In terms of learning, and this is true at Stanford just as it is at other places, there are students who really like abstract principles, general ideas, and can apply them over and over. And there are other people who hate the verbiage, the abstract ideas, whether an abstract idea is in terms of the English language or in terms of mathematical formulas. They want to see this thing in action. They want concreteness. They want illustrations. And at a school like Stanford, you have a higher proportion of abstract thinkers than you do at most schools. Many more abstract thinkers here. Nevertheless, I still would argue that the ratio is close to 50-50. And in schools that have lower selective requirements, you're going to find the concrete group is very much larger than the abstract group. So then how do you teach these two different kinds of people who want want two very different kinds of instruction? Well, what you do is, for everything you want to communicate, you try to give both the abstract principle and some example that brings it home. Now, when you do that, there are problems. Here's a problem that occurs for me. A general principle is made, and I think of 89 stories to illustrate it. And so I tell 3 or 4. I have had, in the early years of teaching, I have had students on an exam write, I can't remember the principle, but let me tell you the story. That is, they really forgot what it was all about, and rather, they see it only, they remember the concrete detail. And that's one reason why, as I handed out today, I use outlines. The outlines constantly reassure the students as what you're at, what the issues are, what the variables are, where you are, and what you're trying to communicate. Now, you don't have to do outlines in this form. You can have outlines on slides. In the medical school, they say hello on a slide. Or you can have, or you could have just an ancient technique known as using chalk on a blackboard and put the outline up there. But I can assure you that in general, first, students are reassured by having an outline. It tells them what the material is, and it makes it easier for them to review it. So they just feel a little bit more relaxed. In addition, what you do by giving them an outline is give yourself a crutch. Sometimes you're going to be talking about some topic where you're not so sure of yourself, where you're not so sure how things flow. And by having prepared the outline and gotten the flow down, you relieve yourself of thinking about that aspect of your teaching and can concentrate on other parts. So the outlines then keep the students from being lost as you give the examples. So you have the abstract principle, the examples, you may repeat the abstract principle, give another example or not, and then you say, next, let's talk, and you're on point 317 or whatever it is. Sometimes, when material is hard, teachers have a tendency to go very slowly. They speak like this, encouraging sleep throughout the room. And the students are trying to concentrate. It is inappropriate and foolish, I think, to be dry and slow in an attempt to be understood. Rather, you're much better off being lively and repetitive. With the same amount of time, you can have several different ways of getting the ideas across, and thereby not have a situation in which the students just sort of drift away from you because they can't follow clearly enough. So I think that with difficult material, that is not an excuse for becoming dry. That's an excuse for being repetitive, for asking over and over. Does everybody get it? Who still has trouble? Really give the students a chance to respond and give yourself a chance to use several different techniques for getting ideas across, rather than thinking that being slow will necessarily do the trick. Any comments or questions about that? Yes?
Yeah, I had a question actually that relating to the outline.
Fine.
If you have some information you really want to get across to the students, and you're planning to write it up on the board or have a slide or a projection or something like that, do you think it's wise to also give them a sheet of paper that has the same information, or to have them actually have to write it down and copy it down and thus maybe remember it better?
That's a very good question, because it says the very act of writing the notes, there is research that shows that writing things down helps you to remember them. Okay. Therefore, would it not be appropriate to have, in addition to an outline, to make sure that the outline doesn't have all the material that ought to be written down, and will thereby encourage the students to remember? I take a position opposite to that, and let me explain why. I think the big danger we have in teaching here at Stanford is not that the students won't learn the material for the test, or that they won't know what's important and get it down, but rather that they will not do any thinking at all and be completely uninvolved. I really prefer situations where I'll say to the class, as I often do, just a second now, I want to go over this. I want none of you to take any notes at all. Just listen to this. And by listening and not feeling that, which words do I write? That you relieve them somewhat of the tedium of the note-taking and give their brains a chance to participate. Now, if it's really important information, why not have it written out for them correctly so that they don't have to say, oh my God, my pen's out of ink. That's a half point on the final. So it would seem to me perfectly all right to have key concepts, formulas, and similar things written so that they can follow along but be listening and thinking and not just writing. I think that your question sounds like I'm giving you a line. I think your question's a good one because I've never really thought about the fact that the other style of writing it down we know increases memory. But at the same time, I think you can count on the students to do a review before exams and to read over what you've done, and they'll probably get it anyway. So I really favor anything you can do to get the students to not be note takers. At least that's my opinion. Okay, yes?
Well, having been in your classes and had outlines, I know that students take notes anyway. So
Yes.
having an outline it's really nice to have because you know what's important, but you also get to take notes on your own opinion of what's being covered and,
Yes, and in fact, I encourage students to take, when I give an outline, I would typically have something like this spread over 2 pages rather than 1, but the Center for Teaching and Learning has a short budget. And so we put it all together on 1 page. But if this were over 2 pages, there'd be big spaces for you to write different things, or different examples, or applications, or principles, or whatever. And I think it does help the students to take notes, to know that the order is taken care of for them. Other comments or questions? Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about office hours, something that people don't ever discuss, and that I think is underestimated in the whole task of teaching and learning. Some years ago, it was a course that some courses that I taught, and we always, if the classes weren't too big, we'd have a party at my house, and we'd split it over 2 nights, and you can be sure that only about half the students say they will come, and about 2/3 of the ones who say they come will come. And so you usually can fit them into the house, a little crowded, but not too bad. And I have had the experience of students saying, this is the second time I've been in a faculty home, because I took another course from you. Now, why did I tell that story? Because with respect to office hours, you'll be shocked at the number of Stanford undergraduates who have never been to any office hour of any faculty member, ever. And they try to avoid them at all costs. Now that's a real problem, because the office hour is advantageous for the students, but also for you, whether you're teaching a section or a whole course, because it gives you an opportunity to get feedback. If you just count on the people who come to the office hour, I labeled them on the average complainers or apple polishers, you know that you're getting a terribly biased sample. There's just no question about it. If most people don't come, then you know darn well there must be some selective principles at work. Now it may be that you're beautiful, or it may be that you're rich, or it may be that you give hard tests, or maybe you help people prepare for tests. Whatever the reasons are, people are coming to you for reasons that you don't want. Instead, what you want is to know what the students think. And so I would urge you, I'll tell you what I do. I just make it a requirement. If everybody's got to come during the office hour. Now, do I still get a bias sample? You bet I do. Because toward the end of the quarter, suddenly my office loads up, and I have to see people in groups of 3 or 4, whereas before, in an office hour, I'd have, let's say, 2 students come to see me, and each one could get 20 or 25 minutes. So it's biased because the feedback is still not coming to you in an orderly fashion. Nevertheless, by saying everybody has to do it, and asking the students about their reactions to the course, the things they're finding most difficult, what they're finding most lively, then you can really help the student feedback to shape the course. And every time I change something in the course as a result of this student feedback, you can bet I do what? Tell them. You say, people who came to my office hours lately have been saying that they wanted more of this, so we're going to do it right now. Or that this has been a problem. Or I say, I find that I misspoke, that I really did something very, very bad. You may think, by the way, that to admit an error is a terrible thing. But in fact, you hardly even get penalized for it. I've never forgotten an experience of mine, which was awful. I started putting up the results of a whole body of research on the blackboard, and I got it completely turned around. And so I had this goes up when that goes up, and it should have been this goes down when that goes up. And so I had it completely backward, and I went on to the next topic, and then I realized it couldn't be. It did not fit in with the other work that we had discussed. It was clearly antithetical to the logical deductions. And so I stopped the class and showed them how what I had just said must be wrong, and I apologized to them for messing it up. At the end of the class, a couple of students came up to me and said, "Sandy, that was a brilliant teaching technique." I said, no, I messed it up. They said, no, we know. At the next meeting of the class, I took a poll, blind, and I found that something like 70% of the students, I don't remember the exact number, thought that it was an intentional thing on my part to show how interrelated these phenomena were. So my point is that even if you do make a mistake, and even if you do say mea culpa, they won't blame you much, and they may think, isn't it clever, the way in which this gets pointed out to us and becomes even more salient because of having been brought to our attention. So, making an office hour a requirement, and you can do that in a section pretty easily because there aren't that many students, and I do it for classes up to 100. Making it a requirement is something that really helps you. And when you talk to the students during the office hour, before you talk about anything relating to the course, ask them about themselves. Now I know you're going to get the usual status statements. I am from Tacoma, Washington. I am a junior. I'm a member of this something or other team or fraternity or sorority or whatever. But by asking them about themselves, you personalize the relationship, and you don't just ask where they're from, ask them where are they going. Anything about their expectations and aspirations is helpful to you because it can help you to understand why they want more on certain topics or less, or why they think something is very difficult and unnecessary, or why they wish they were even more of a particular thing. So that you can use this emphasis on their own personal background and aspirations, and they can feel that you're somebody who cares a little bit about them, which I hope is not a lie. Sometimes by being more personal, you get involved in things you didn't want to be involved in. There are people, and it's sad to say, at a school like Sanford, there are people who feel so lonely that the slightest willingness on someone's part to relate directly to them produces an outburst of concerns, of depression, of fears, or whatever. And you have to use your own judgment, but say to yourself over and over again, I am not a therapist. You've got to know your own limits. And you have to try to be helpful, to be warm, to be a mirror reflecting back to them what they have said, but not give advice on basic decisions. The line I use all the time, which is absolutely true, is I have trouble running my own life. How can I help anybody else? On the other hand, there are times when specific things are up where you find, oh, I don't know much about that occupation, but I know somebody who's in it. And I'll give you the name. Why don't you give them a call and talk to them? And sometimes this is remarkable. For example, 2 times this has happened of people at UC San Francisco at the medical school there, where students would ask about things that I really didn't know anything about, and I'd have them get in touch with people at UC San Francisco, and they'd get a job with that person instantly, which makes them feel that you are really knocking yourself out for them, and all you meant was for them to go somewhere else for better advice. So in this office hour, I think you can accomplish a great deal. You can find out what they are enjoying, what they are finding difficult. I always ask them which lectures they preferred, which ones were the worst. And that doesn't mean you have to act on everything you're told, but at least it gives you a basis for understanding. Now, we're getting near the end. And I want to talk just for a few seconds about the internal and external rewards of teaching. Oh, you got a question? Go ahead. See, notice this. I didn't even pause. I was debating whether to pause. And I thought, well, I'll pause at the end when I know that I have enough time. And already, in just this little group, we've arranged enough of an atmosphere where you can talk that you would interrupt me. So I'm approving of that, and I think that's great. And it tells you you can do it. Go ahead.
I had an experience in the TA office hours with a student who was having a great difficulty with the material. And I suggested, because the teacher was excellent, wrote the book on the subject, and he's very friendly and doesn't bite, that she go talk to him during his office hours, make her avail herself to that opportunity. However, she got very bashful and said, oh no, I couldn't do that. And I have a feeling it was a cultural thing. And I don't, if she's Chinese, and I didn't know how to encourage her to go.
Well, you know what I would do if I were in your place? Ask the teacher to call her and say, hey, I hear you have some problems with this. Why don't you come into my office hour? How about Thursday at 2?
Would that work, or would I just embarrass her?
Oh, look, you're not going to end her embarrassment. What you want her to embarrassment is not the problem. The problem is that she doesn't understand. She needs help. You or and the teacher together, or the teacher alone, or you alone, have to work out some kind of program to make up for this, to make up for these problems. And so you should not worry about embarrassment. That is the least of your problems. I think you really, I appreciate what you're telling me, but it's reminiscent of many things that I have found happen here at Stanford, where the students are frightened or unwilling, very foolishly in many cases. Now, that doesn't mean that all faculty are equally welcoming. We all know that. We all know that. But in general, if the faculty members are not welcoming, it's up to the TAs to do the job. And by talking about what comes up in the office hours to the faculty member, give the faculty member a little sense of what he or she is missing. I think that would be a very important thing to do when you have a person who has trouble breaking through that barrier. Okay, moving on. I want to talk about the internal and external rewards. The internal rewards are serious and important. In elementary school, one of my colleagues here in the School of Education has found that the teachers report the main pleasure they get from teaching is students who tell them they're learning a lot and that they're happy about what they learned. And especially to have a kid come back and say, what you taught me in 5th grade made such a difference. That's enough to go for 3 months with no rewards from the system. In the elementary schools, there aren't differences in salary, there aren't that many differences in assignments and so on, and the teachers are really very dependent on feedback from the students. Well, so are teachers here at Stanford. Now, we have an evaluation system, and I urge you to read those evaluations with care and concern, and to encourage all the students to fill them out. A lot of students, when it comes to TAs, for example, don't fill out that part of the thing, and it's up to the teacher and the TAs to say, this is very important, this will help us so much, make sure you fill this out. It's also the case that some TAs get feedback about 1/3 to 1/2 of the way through the course, so that it doesn't come too late for them to change things, and thereby they're getting some feedback en route. Now, those
I'm sorry, may I ask a question? When would you consider the ideal time? Because we do the TA evaluations right at top different professors after the midterm.
Well, that's a good time, I think, except for one small problem. If you do it just right after the midterm, the next day, all that's in their mind is, I got a B minus. What a lousy TA I must have.
When would you find that's the ideal time?
I would wait, let's say, somewhere around the middle, plus a week or so, away from the tests. You don't want everything to be rushed by the test.
After?
I would think so.
Because we
But
like to do it in time to make changes.
well, there's still a large part of the quarter.
Michelle and Jack and Sanford.
No, I think there's a lot of the quarter. The question is to when to do these evaluations. The earlier you do them, the lower the value of the feedback in terms of their having a good basis for their judgment. But on the other hand, the more time you have to react to it. On the other hand, if you do it late, their judgments are more fixed and your responses are much weaker. Now, those internal rewards are very real, very real. I've had people stop me on the streets today of Chicago or something and just say, what a great teacher you were years ago. And they say, gee, I'm sorry I interrupted you. And I tell them, what are you talking about? You've made my day. Now, I pretend to myself there are a lot of other people who would like to say these pleasant things, and I don't imagine all the negative comments that are also being held back. But when you look at the evaluations, I want you to all realize there are going to be some very nasty things said. It doesn't matter how good you are. There's going to be somebody who writes an evaluation indicating that you have just come out of the toilet. What you have to do is to look at the bulk of them and look at the things that people seem to constantly mention. If several people mention the same thing, it's probably something you have to work on or you have to worry about. But that's a wonderful basis for feedback. And you have to feel good about your teaching. You want to feel that you're making a difference. And look for all the support that you can get that way. How about the external rewards? There aren't that many usually. Here at Stanford, well, there are rewards for teaching at schools that aren't research universities. But at a school like Stanford, I actually have done research on this in humanities and sciences. I can tell you the findings very quickly. Essentially, on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 the top, 5 at the bottom, when we first did the study, and this is about 20 years ago, it was 1.5 was the average importance of research in such things as affecting your salary, your promotions, your rank. And 4 was the average rating of the importance of teaching. Service counted 5 on a 5-point scale. The university then changed, as a result of this study, changed the long form for appointments. And this is hilarious to think that a bureaucratic thing like this could make any difference. It used to say, what evidence is there of good teaching? And believe it or not, after writing that little phrase, what evidence is there of good teaching, the form had ... to the end of the line, and that was all the space you had. Now, you didn't get a sense then that teaching was of enormous importance in their promotion. And so what they did was just change it completely. Lots of space. They have sections. You're supposed to fill out auxiliary things. You have to hand in the student ratings. In the English department, it's faculty ratings of the faculty member. And in various ways, they did things which, upon the next testing, the average rating of teaching went from 4.5 to 3.5, which is a substantial increase. You're not going to change the relative importance. So most of the reward you get for teaching at a school like this is internal, not external. Occasionally, it's external. I had a very strange experience. I was giving a speech to a bunch of Stanford alums in New York, and they had some woman, head of a foundation, introduce me. And all she talked about was her daughter. I just sat there listening as she discussed her daughter, wondering, what is this about? And it turned out her last lines were that Sandy was her teacher, that he changed her life. Everything that she's done since, of which I'm so proud as her mother, is a product of what Sandy did in that one course. I didn't even remember her at all. I felt very funny. Now, to the external rewards. Since then, her mother has given me $105,000 for research, which is very pleasant. And I mention this to say there are some external rewards. There are some, even at a place like this, but they are rare. And what you really have to say is, it's going to be the internal that matters. And what you also have to say is, I'm doing a good job as a teacher because that's my job. It's your responsibility. It is not something that the Center for Teaching and Learning has to induce in you, a feeling that you should knock yourself out to do well. This is an important part of this vocation, and I use that in the sense of a calling, This vocation demands that you put out for students. And the whole society supports it more for the putting out for students than it does for the contributions to research. Now, you won't hear that in the laboratories, but in fact, that's the reality of a university like this. And so, if you knock yourself out to do a good job on teaching, and there are lots of things that we can all do better, then I think you're doing not just that which makes you feel better internally, but also you can have a sense that you are more appropriately fitting the dimensions of the job that you've taken on. So stop there. I didn't have time for any questions at the end because I hit 1 o'clock on the absolute button. By the way, do you know how you do that? Do you know how to always end on the button? You have a topic that you could talk on for an hour or 15 seconds. Right? And so you look at your watch and decide how much you're going to say about that. Responsibility. Now there's a topic. How many hours could we devote to responsibility? Okay, any comments or questions? Yeah.
I have a specific question going back to discussion section.
Go ahead.
When you're in a discussion section and you're maybe reviewing some aspects of the lecture or some ideas and you're asking for input from the students about what they thought was important or some ideas they have, some are good and you're writing them up on the board, and then one comes up and it's just way out there, it's wrong, or would take the discussion into a much different avenue. How do you respond in a constructive way to direct the discussion back or to tell them that that's not quite what you were looking for?
That's a very hard question. I'm glad you saved it. The question is, what do you do when somebody in, say, a review of what's been covered in lectures and what was hard, difficult, important, etc., someone is way off base? What you have to do is to some way translate. You can't just ignore the statement. And what should that translation consist of? One possibility is to say that this is the more, and honestly,